The main problems of international economics and international politics are at some level also problems of international organization. As interdependence increases, the importance of international organizations increases with it. We find international organizations, in one form or another, at the heart of all of the political and economic challenges of the 21st century. From international credit markets to endangered species, to war crimes and torture, today's leading controversies all involve some measure of international cooperation and commitment, managed through international organizations. Some international organizations work well, and some work hardly at all. Some need radical reform, and some need strengthening. To understand how the world works, requires understanding of the politics, powers, and limits of international organizations. In this module of the course, we shall try to answer the following 3 questions. First, obligations. In other words, what are the obligations that countries consent to when they join the organization? We have already learned that international organizations were all founded by interstate treaties. These treaties spell out the goals and powers of the organization, and the obligations and rules that member states must take on. When governments join international organizations, they promise to accept whatever rules or obligations are included in these treaties. These may include rules that are explicitly set out in the treaty. For example, the Statute of the International Court of Justice says that decisions of the court are final and binding on the states in the dispute. They may as well include indirect obligations that emerge in the course of the operation of the organization. For example, when the UN Charter gives the Security Council the authority to create new legal obligations on all UN members. The former are known in advance by states when they join the organization. The latter are more open-ended, and involve some risk that future practice might create obligations on states that they were not expecting. When assessing the impact of international organizations, we must be realistic about these obligations. It is easy to criticize the UN General Assembly, for instance, on the grounds that it passes many resolutions that UN members then fail to implement. However, this complaint makes little sense, when we recall that the UN Charter gives the General Assembly only the power to make recommendations to states, and does not give it the power to take decisions or impose new obligations. UN members do not commit themselves to carry out General Assembly resolutions. Many of the UN's member states would likely not have joined the organization, if the General Assembly had been given the power to push them through binding resolutions. Second, compliance. Do and should states in practice abide by these obligations? With some understanding of the legal obligations of states, we can then consider how well states comply with those obligations. Compliance is almost always about the choice of states. There are 2 time frames, where states' consent is explicit in and around international organizations. At the moment of joining the organization, and at the point where states see the opportunity to follow or to violate its rules. One recent example is North Korea. In 2003, North Korea announced that it was withdrawing from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Its withdrawal from the treaty left it free from the binding force of its Safeguards Agreement with the International Atomic Energy Agency. It is common to think about international organization at those moments where a state is faced with strong incentives to go against some rule of an international organization. This is often in the context of an international crisis, where a country wants to violate the rules. This was the case, for instance, with the American decision to invade Iraq in 2003, despite the fact that the UN Security Council refused to grant the necessary authorization. These are often dramatic moments, as they put state choices directly against international rules. Not surprisingly, the record of state compliance with international organizations, at such moments is mixed. Given sufficient incentive, states are often willing to ignore their legal obligations. Though we should not ignore those very interesting cases where states choose to comply despite the incentive to violate. Finally, enforcement. It is rare that international organizations take effective enforcement action against states who fail to abide by their obligations. A few organizations do have robust means of enforcing the rules against violators. For instance, the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, can withhold further loans from a non-compliant state. The UN Security Council can authorize military action against a state that threatens international peace and security. Such a threat is by itself a violation of the UN Charter. And the World Trade Organization can authorize trade sanctions against members who violate their commitments. But the more normal condition is that members usually face a very indirect threat of punishment for their violations. For instance, the threat of a loss of reputation that might come from being publicly branded as a rule breaker. International organizations' enforcement often involves playing on the apparent desire of states to be seen by their colleagues in a positive light, as good international citizens. This may be very powerful indeed, but it follows a different logic than more direct kinds of enforcement threats. The absence of direct enforcement power is often held up as evidence of the irrelevance, or at least the marginal importance of international organizations. And, perhaps, as a justification for paying little attention to their rules and decisions.